What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I'm going to be talking about 30 to 50 Feral Hogs, the Razor Swine Twobert, inspired by Andy Mangold's 100 Ornithopters cube, which has been quite the rage in the cube scene as of late. But before we get into things, I want to talk about Shoebox. Shoebox is a Magic event coming up at the St. Paul River Center next month, March 13th through the 15th. You can find details on that at shoebox.gg is their website. There's going to be a big cube main event there. Going to be a big CDH event, plenty of side events, Commander, Cube, whatever you want. Check that out there. Going to be happening just across the river from me, so it's going to be in St. Paul. I intend to be there, probably playing the main event. I'm going to have stickers for the podcast. I have some nice stickers with the podcast logo, so find me if you want to get one of those stickers, or you just want to talk shop. I went to CubeCon a couple years ago. Unfortunately, I missed it in 2025. It was the same weekend as some commentary work I was doing in Houston, but working CubeCon in 2024 was really fun for me to just kind of get more in touch with people in the Cube community. A lot of people showed me a lot of love, which was great, and just kind of rubbing elbows with a lot of the people that are as passionate about Cube as I am was a lot of fun. And I am really looking forward to meeting some more people in the Cube sphere at Shoebox next month. But regarding that, I do just want to talk about what is happening in Minnesota as things stand today. I know that people are concerned about travel, about what's happening here. So, quick update on what's happening in the Twin Cities metro area. So I guess the lead in the headlines right now is that last week the end of Operation Metro Surge was announced. I don't trust these DHS ghouls as far as I can throw them, so kind of just waiting and seeing. This is not the end of anything, right? What has been happening in Minnesota is not some acute crisis, not some small fire that will burn itself out. This didn't start in Minnesota. This is not going to end in Minnesota. And it sucks and it's hard, but it doesn't make it any less true. But just as far as any concern about maybe traveling here, I mean, for us here every day, some semblance of normal life must, and does go on, right? We still all have to go to work. And so, I mean, I'm going to be at Shoebox no matter what. I live in Minneapolis. So what has been happening here is just an aspect of life. And something that I've stressed on the podcast before is it's important for us to still experience and cultivate joy. And Shoebox is going to be a fun weekend. We're going to celebrate together. Our joy will burn bright and will help carry us through these dark times. But the dark times do continue. We still have to continue expressing solidarity and working with each other. I'm going to have that link that I've been posting in the show notes regarding Minnesota Mutual Aid, some ways you can help us out. The need here is still great and enduring. We're talking about food shelves, legal assistance, rent assistance, all that stuff. I mean, this was a major disruption, and it's not over. It has been an official announcement, but we'll see when they're gone, when we can confirm an actual downtick in the presence of DHS here, and the need is going to continue. It's been a hard time. It's going to continue being a hard time, but we're going to continue showing up and showing out for each other and contributing where we can in the ways that we are best able to. I know that we're going to see the other side of this. Minnesota is going to remain an incredible and kind place full of incredible and kind people. Just right now, there's a lot of need. There is a lot of work to do. And on that front, just regarding traveling to Shoebox, I do just want to stress something that even if you're not able to contribute, I understand money is tight for a lot of people for a lot of reasons, contributing to these mutual aid funds. And even if you've already contributed, you only have so much money to go around. I get that. One thing is that Operation Metro Surge has been really damaging to a lot of local businesses. If you're able to make it out to this event and you can just spend a little bit of money at some local restaurants, check out the local businesses here. The scene has definitely been hurting in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. Shoebox is in St. Paul. I know that a lot of the attention is specifically focused on Minneapolis, the Twin Cities. I mean, we're all in this together. It's a lot bigger than just one city. I mean, this has been all of Minnesota, really, and it has been all of the country. really. So that solidarity there. If you can patronize Minnesota small businesses, if you're able to do that, that would be awesome for us. I know that the local economy has really been hurting with Metro Surge here. So if you're interested and able, I'd love to see you in the Twin Cities next month. You can go to shoebox.gg to pre-register. That's March 13th to the 15th at the St. Paul River Center there. Pre-registering is also really helpful for any Magic tournament, but specifically these cube events. They're pretty logistically complex. It's really good to have a head count ahead of time so things can run smoothly. So get your tickets for Shoebox, and I will see you next month. So now let's get to talking about some Razor Swines. So 30 to 50 Feral Hogs is a Twobert that breaks singleton specifically for the card Razor Swine. But before I really get into that, there's some interesting history here. I want to just talk about the projects I worked on or was inspired by leading up to the design of this cube and how this really came to be, because this did not happen overnight. So the first place I want to start is with the Toxic Twobert. This was a Twobert that I designed around the poison mechanic right around the release of Phyrexia All Will Be One with the toxic mechanic. And that had Infect, Toxic, Swamp Mosquito, just any implementation of poison counters across the history of Magic. And I wanted to build a cube where overwhelmingly you won with poison. And I wrote an article about that cube on Star City Games. This is back when I was still writing about Cube for them. And one thing about that cube is I ended up color restricting it. I had no red cards, and in the article there I call out there's only 3 red cards that involve poison counters at all. They're all from new Phyrexia. There's 3 creatures, and it just wasn't enough to have red exist in that environment and have the environment be as much about poison as I wanted it to be. So I color restricted it then. But even at the time, I even wrote in my article that I adore Razor Swine. I actually drafted a lot of Scars of Mirrodin Block, New Phyrexia. That was my first Pro Tour. One of my favorite decks I've ever drafted in Retail Limited was a blue-red Infect deck with Blighted Agents and Razor Swines, which all had to come from the New Phyrexia pack, and there was only one New Phyrexia pack, so that was a lot of fun. I have a lot of nostalgia for the card Razor Swine. But then regarding the Toxic Twobert, that was a cube that I only ended up drafting a handful of times. I learned pretty quickly that the incentives were just too different between Toxic and Infect. Pump spells were just not as appealing, and so despite the fact that all of the cards, the creatures would all try to win the game with poison counters, it still didn't feel that different from having some creatures with Infect and some without, which just kind of puts you in this 50-50 mix. It's not as pronounced as a creature that does not have Toxic, just creatures dealing regular combat damage is the only thing that they do. But the draft environment, it just was not up to my standards. There was some cool stuff going on there, but ultimately it ended up getting kind of picked apart, and most of the cards just lived together in a box in my closet for a while. And then Andy Mangold rocked the cube world with his 100 Ornithopters cube. I'm going to have a link to that cube list in the show notes, as well as the excellent video that Ristic Studies did about the cube. And I had the pleasure of covering a draft of that cube at CubeCon in 2024. It's really fun to see how that played out. We featured Caleb Durward as our main drafter there. And I've also played a version of the 100 Ornithopters cube that a friend constructed locally. And it's a really fascinating restriction to design around. So the cube is singleton, except there are 100 copies of Ornithopter. That's the only creature. And by design, you have to win the game by engaging with Ornithopter in some capacity. And I was so impressed and amazed by this project that after drafting it, I knew I needed a way to distill some of the magic of 100 Ornithopters into a Twobert environment. But something that's really difficult there, the thing that really makes 100 Ornithopters work is that Ornithopter is very cool, but it's not nothing that 100 is just a really clean number. I consider it essential to the environment that there are 100 Ornithopters. It's a cool number that you have to draft them, that they are in the draft. There's been plenty of experiments with cubes in the past where you get to add whatever number of something you want after the draft, just like the basic land box. but having 100 of something in the cube, that's what's really inspiring here. It's so much that you would think, well, of course you can get as many as you want, but it's still finite. And as you draft it, you discover that there's decks that want different numbers of copies of Ornithopter. It's also really charming, funny, and fun to see the packs that have like 5, 6, 7, 8 Ornithopters in them. And so I've been thinking about how to distill that down to a Twobert experience. And it's tough because you can't really have 100 of anything with only 180 slots. That's over a half of your real estate. You're going to have lands on top of that. Probably. I don't know. Maybe you could do this in a fully colorless or monocolor way. I mean, this is not a solved space by any means. Cube is not a solved space, and this microcosm of Cube is not a solved space. A lot of people have been exploring in the 100 Ornithopter space, trying to build around something where that's the only way to win the game. There's been some cool projects, there's been some weird projects. So again, there's a lot of space to explore even once you get into this specific niche of a niche, which is the cool thing about Cube. You can really do whatever you want. The only limit is your own creativity. But for my purposes, I was trying to figure out, okay, half of 100 is 50, but 50 is just not a cool number. Not the way that 100 is. I mean, there's something to be said about base 10 and just 100. It's the first three-digit number. 50 is just halfway to 100. It's fine. Like a $50 is neat. You don't see them too often, but I just didn't have anything there. And then I remembered the viral post, the meme about 30 to 50 feral hogs. And if you're not familiar with that, don't worry about it. It was just some jackass saying something stupid. The main takeaway is that feral hogs, it's a very funny adjective and noun, both the word feral and hogs. They're kind of uncommon and they're fun to say. And then also, 30 to 50 is a hilarious and outrageous range of something to declare. If you can confidently say it's at least 30, but no more than 50, when does that ever come up? Like in terms of estimating something that hasn't happened yet, sure. But if it's something in front of you, it doesn't make any sense to say 30 to 50 instead of 30 to 40 or 40 to 50. It's just nonsense. So the whole string of words is just hilarious. So 30 to 50 feral hogs is just a really fun thing to say, and for that reason, I knew it would be a great cube name. And so then I had to figure out how to translate that into Magic. So I did a Scryfall search for all of the boars in Magic. I actually had to piece together, I had to think about what is the creature equivalent of hog? Is it pig? No, it's boars. I looked at all the boars in Magic, and there it was. My beloved Razor Swine, the perfect card. If you don't know it, red and 2, 2/1, first strike, infect. Dealing poison counters in red is so antithetical to red's color identity. This is just this really goofy creature, this feral hog that doesn't make sense in Magic's color pie, that overwhelmingly red cards don't play well with Razor Swine. It could only exist in the specific time and limited environment that it did, and I'm so glad that it does, because as soon as I looked at Razor Swine, I had this premise. I already had the bones for a cube built around poison counters, and everything just started to line up. I'm going to have 30 to 50 Razor Swines. That's going to be the only or most of the red cards in the cube, and then I already have some stuff to explore with white, blue, black, and green, and I just need to turn that into a 180 card cube. And there was a good amount more work and refinement from there. At this point, I've drafted 30 to 50 feral hogs with, I think, no less than 10 different people. And I will say that everybody has been really delighted by the concept, and there's been stuff that I've tried that has not played great, but after drafting and playing, everybody that I've played with so far has been really intrigued to see how the environment shakes out and to play it again. This has been a really successful and fun project. And as far as talking through the cube list, I'm going to have the Cube Cobra link in the show notes here. I think what makes the most sense to me is to talk about just types of cards, because there's really only so much that can work. Once you marry yourself to 1 3 mana, 2/1 first striking infect creature, you have to rule out so many things that exist in Magic. Like from a baseline, I have so many red cards just off the back of having that many Razor Swines. That means there's not really much room for more red cards. I'm not going to have burn spells. They don't really make sense here. And so I kind of narrowed in on some specific categories, some kind of cards that I wanted to have work in this cube. And some of these were stuff that I had immediately, and I refined the list over time. And some of the things I discovered and added to the environment as I worked on it. So I'm going to talk about categories of cards here. And the first I want to talk about is pump spells. Pump spells were a fundamental aspect of the Toxic Twobert when it comes to any constructed Infect deck. Pump spells are just the whole story there. You have a creature with Infect, presumably a cheap one, and you use pump spells because with poison you only need to deal 10 instead of 20, so every pump spell functionally is twice as effective on an Infect creature. That said, constructed rarely translates one-to-one for cube, especially when it comes to tuberts when you narrow in and every deck is kind of caring about the same thing. When you have an environment that is designed where everybody should be casting Razor Swines, that's the only way that you can win the game. Then pump spells become kind of awkward because of Infect, your creatures just trade. Razor Swine natively has First Strike and Infect, so you can't give First Strike as a trick here. What's going to happen anytime two Razor Swines enter combat, they will both deal First Strike damage in the form of -1/-1 counters. So Giant Growth is not going to save you. Once state-based effects are checked on the following turn, sure, you Giant Growth and you survive the turn, but then at the next beginning of turn, your creature has two -1/-1 counters and is no longer buffed by Giant Growth. So it dies before you can do anything to save it. So pump spells are meaningful in this environment. I want to have some of those combo kills that constructed Infect decks are known for. Cards like Invigorate are going to be meaningful here in terms of dealing your opponent a lot of poison counters in one quick burst, but you have to be really careful, I find, on over-indexing on just +X/+X, because the cards are only useful either to save yourself from some kind of -X/-X removal spell or to damage your opponent. They are useless in the sense of engaging with creatures in combat, which is historically, especially in an environment where everybody's going to be playing this same creature, you are going to want pump spells that matter in combat that allow you to survive some kind of combat exchange. So for that reason, you see a lot of +1/+1 counters. Typically, I try to find things that can give multiple +1/+1 counters because it does take two to actually survive a Razor Swine exchange in combat. But there's some amount of one, and that will interact with some of the removal spells in the cube. And there's also a decent clip of Proliferate, so you can get one and proliferate, and that way you can survive in combat. So you have to work for it a little bit there. But for the most part, I wanted to have a little bit of that stuff that can just eliminate your opponent in one big turn. But then it's also important to have a good clip of stuff that actually allows Razor Swines to engage in combat and for you to come ahead in that exchange where you can trade your pump spell with their creature instead of always needing to trade your creature with their creature. Next, I want to talk about removal spells. Removal spells are a pretty fundamental aspect of this environment. When you know that everybody's going to be playing a lot of a 3-mana creature, and that is how decks are going to try to win the game, then it is pretty easy to talk yourself into playing a lot of removal spells. They are cards you're going to prioritize pretty highly, and even ones that are a little bit mopey are going to make your deck. So I do have some really powerful removal spells here. I have some 0 and 1 mana stuff that will cleanly answer a Razor Swine, which makes it so that the games can take a little bit longer. You play a little bit more of an attrition game. I like that. I also like finding slots for some dumpier removal spells. Hornet Sting is a favorite of mine in green. 1 green mana instant, deal 1 damage to any target. So that will kill a Razor Swine for 1 mana if there's no trickery involved. Green was also just generally a tough color because you want some of those combo kill pump spells, but most pump spells in greens don't give you +1/+1 counters, and so they have kind of awkward texture. So finding green cards that play that aren't just like strong card advantage cards that take over the game finding a home for a goofy one like Hornet Sting is something I really like here. Removal spells, of course, are an aspect of most any cube environment, so I don't have to sell you on those, but it's just the kind of thing where, when in doubt, committing a slot to a removal spell was an easy thing to do for this design. Also, regarding Hornet Sting, I just really like cards in this cube that reference different animal names in the Feral Hog cube. So Hornet Sting, I really like Dog Umbra. Anything that gives flying, like Evolution Charm, is really funny because you can do the when pigs fly joke. So some cheeky stuff in that regard there. And then to combat all these removal spells, I have a good sampling of protection spells. This is something that, given that you are going to have to cross the finish line with your Razor Swines, you want to make sure that you can use protection spells. They can be useful, some of them in terms of saving your creature from a combat exchange, surviving an encounter with another Razor Swine and living to tell about it, or to protect you from those removal spells. So stuff like God's Willing, just a good sampling of that, mostly keeping this stuff to 1 and 2 mana, especially because there is a good sampling of 0 and 1 mana removals. The 2 mana stuff, it's less desirable, but it still makes decks. You'll play a card like Shelter here, and when you can make it work, it's really powerful. It's also really interesting, the texture of games you can end up in with these protection spells, because you can use them, certainly the stuff that gives protection from a color, to make a good attack into a Razor Swine, but that means that you are the first to act, and you could be exposing yourself to one of those 0 or 1 mana removal spells. So some really interesting texture with protection spells there, really important to make more of a game involving the removal spells in the cube. Another thing that I really enjoy in this environment is stuff that uses life as a cost, largely because it's funny. Nobody has lost in this cube to just normal damage. 20 life is something that you'll have some cards that cost life, like Snuff Out and Dismember are really high picks, but if you get a high enough clip of those and fetch lands, you can run out. Stuff like Unspeakable Symbol, that does brush up against some of the other powerful black effects, and there's not really life gain here to make that back up. So you have 20 points you can kind of spend on effects. Also, a really funny joke that my friend Liz Lynn, co-team Baltimore Open champion Liz Lynn, we were playing this in Portland, and I would cast Dismember, and I would say, all right, I'm at 16 if it matters. And so every time we changed our life total, we would announce our life total and say, if it matters. And I really like that joke a lot. So it's something that you can run out. There's a lot of high picks that do involve spending life. It is not realistically how a game is going to end, but it is finite, and it's really fun when you get down to 7 in this environment where your opponent is never dealing you any damage. I also am really hopeful for the eventual game someday when somebody dies to Hornet Sting. On a long enough timeline, it will happen. On the topic of life as a cost, I'm really big on modal dual-faced cards. I have a lot of spells that are lands on the backside here, so you can choose to play them as spells or as a land. These are largely going to be things like protection spells and removal spells, and you have some of the Modern Horizons 3 stuff where you can pay 3 life to have them enter untapped. These are meaningful for the next category of card I'm going to talk about, but just in general, when you have to hit your 3rd land drop, but you don't have much incentive to continue making land drops beyond that, there's some really interesting texture there, where this cube has a lot of stuff that you can do for 0 and 1 mana, but you cannot play the game until you hit 3 mana, you have red mana, and you can cast Razor Swines. So there's a real risk of flooding, because you need 3 lands, but so much of your stuff is so cheap. So modal dual-face cards to keep your spell density high while making sure you can play enough lands. I generally play 17 lands in this cube. I think that there's realistic arguments for 15, 16, depending on what you have in your deck. There's a lot of Surveillance, Crylands, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Blue has some really powerful cantrips. For the most part, though, I count modal dual-face cards as lands, and I'm usually playing like 5 to 8 MDFCs as lands. And in your opening hand, when you draw them, often I'll play them tapped early. The cost of a tapped land on turn 1 and 2 is functionally 0 in this cube because your opponent can't cast a Razor Swine until turn 3. So Mortal Dual Face cards play really well in this environment in terms of just finessing those mana requirements and giving you a spell density, preventing you from flooding when you need to play more lands than a lot of your spells would indicate that you would want to. So really important. Mortal Dual Face cards massively load bearing for this cube. And they also play well with pitch spells, your Force of Wills, your Contagions. Those are two cards that I really valued highly having in the Toxic Twobert because Infect, I think of Infect as a constructed deck. Certainly it has a modern pedigree, but also a legacy pedigree. I think about Invigorate, Berserk, and I think about Force of Will. So that's a card I really wanted to have here. And then I also have some of their more obscure counterparts in the Scars of the Veteran and in Bounty of the Hunt, the white and green entry in those cycles from alliances. These cards are just sweet. They pair really naturally with Mortal Dual Face cards. It's really fun to have broken 0 mana stuff, and it's also gated by the fact that every game involves casting 3 mana 2/1s. It's not uncommon to see a big fight with both players casting 2 or 2 to 4 spells the same turn at one stage in the game, but that can't really happen until turn 4 because it needs to start with the Razor Swine. So it's pretty unique, and in my opinion, this stuff is cool as hell. And speaking of unique as cool as hell, I also have Blazing Shoal. I have a couple non-Razor Swine red cards here, and I just love the way that pitch cards play here. I also have a number of cards in this cube that exist to make Blazing Shoal lethal in one hit, which means you need to exile something that is a red card that has mana value of at least 8. So I have a number of split cards that are going to do the heavy lifting there. Rough Tumble is a pretty important one. That's a Pyroclasm. It does 2 damage for 2 mana to all non-flying creatures, so it's a nice sweeper. I'll come back to talk about sweepers specifically in a little bit, but it also has a 6 mana mode to deal 6 damage to each flyer. That doesn't come up. It just makes it so the card's mana value is 8, and so it's lethal with Blazing Shoal, Hit, Run, Who, What, When, Where, Why. Just a nice sampling of stuff that makes Blazing Shoal lethal, and you can just cast it for red X some of the time. Blazing Shoal was a card. It still is actually currently banned in Modern. It was banned after the first Modern Pro Tour because of the mono blue Infect deck that Sam Black took to top 4. So just having some of these iconic constructed cards show up in this environment built around poison is something that I valued really highly, and the conceits of this cube made Blazing Shoal a pretty nice fit. I don't actually think it's one of the strongest cards, but it's a card that I basically never pass because it's so fun. And you can try to line up the protection spell for the lethal Blazing Shoal. It is one of the scariest cards in the cube and something you kind of have to have on your mind if your opponent has access to it. So I'm a huge fan of having a home for that one here. The pitch cards also make it a little bit easier to have some cards that aren't always at their best. A specific card that comes to mind, it's similar to Blazing Shoal, is Hatred, an iconic card that is useful for making one lethal attack in one turn, just a surprise lethal. It's a 5 mana black instant where you pay X life and target creature gets +X/+O until end of turn. This was part of the black aggro decks back in the late 90s, one of the first decks to really see a lot of success or gain a lot of notoriety in the game. So Hatred is a really cool card from Exodus, just kind of an iconic aspect of early Magic. And I think it's really tough to leverage a 5 mana card in this environment because all of those 0 and 1 mana pieces of interaction. But there's also just 4 black pitch cards in the cube. So you can put it in your deck. Sometimes it hasn't happened yet. Nobody has died to Hatred in the cube yet, but there are ways to leverage the Hatred where it's not just bad to put it in your deck, even if it's going to be weak a lot of the time, because pitching it to cast Unmask is still getting some use out of the card. You want to have a density of black spells, and you also kind of have to play a baseline of red spells because you have to play Razor Swines. So just having some stuff that's a little bit more situational, the pitch cards open up that space a little bit and make it a little bit more welcome to have some of these iconic cards that don't always really punch up to their weight class there. All right, so now let's talk about sweepers. When it comes to Twoberts, I often Eschew sweepers. I don't have anything that like destroys all artifacts on the artifact Twobert. I have a very light touch for sweepers in the original recipe Twobert. Really nothing in the tempo Twobert. There's engineered explosives, but that's not a true sweeper. I find that once you have such a small card list and you pursue one macro archetype, having a sweeper can just be really punishing. Either you draw it and your deck does too much to play into the sweeper otherwise, or somebody plays it and they're able to get around the general constraints of the cube and it just becomes this really back-breaking card that is going to be fully one-sided and lead to not very fun games. And both of those extremes are undesirable, right? You have a card in your deck that's bad or a card in your deck that you cast and you can't lose. I don't really want either of those things to happen, and this can be a category of card that leads to both. When it comes to Razor Swine, though, I just want to talk about the math of playing with and against this card. So your opponent casts a Razor Swine. One hog is a problem. You're facing down a 2-power infect creature. It takes 5 hits for lethal. You might have a 1/1 removal spell, but let's say you don't, and they cast a second Razor Swine. So they cast the second one, attack with the first one, you have 2 poison. You're facing down 4 poison on the next turn. And if you fail that removal check again, they cast a third. Now they attack you with their 2 Razor Swines. So that puts you up to 6 poison. That means 2 more hits and you're dead. And they cast a third. That means that a 1/1 removal spell cannot get you out of it. You just cannot find yourself in a position where you're down by 3 Razor Swines because the game is over. You are just dead. So the cube does kind of necessitate that you have a catch-up mechanic here. So Rough Tumble, I really like that one because of the Blazing Shoal synergy. And then I have Wrath of God here, just to have a little bit more in the space of sweepers. You gotta have kind of an off switch. Otherwise, some of the games are just going to be like, okay, well, I had a bunch of pump spells, but my opponent had more Razor Swines first. Having a little bit of stuff, certainly with a Rough Tumble, where any player could have access to it, is going to be castable no matter what. That's really valuable to making sure that you don't just have these games where, okay, well, I fell behind and then I just easily lost because the math clearly dictates that I lose. So sweepers, pretty important part of the texture of the environment here. Which is similarly how I justify Contagion in the environment, which can be just a 0 mana clean up 2 of your opponent's 3 drops on the environment. That can be a huge swing, but because of the way the game just totally ends if you have the 3 Razor Swine curve uncontested, and the fact that you're going to be aware there's enough in the 2-for-1 on the battlefield space. Not a ton, I think it's just the 3 cards, Wrath of God, Rough, and Contagion, but you have to be aware of those, and it's going to give you some pause. You have to cast your second Razor Swine to be exposed to these cards in the way that they can be backbreaking. So there's play to it. You know, it's gated around Razor Swine like everything in this cube. So the texture is really interesting, and I think that the texture here does give players a lot of meaningful agency around this. It's going to be appealing to try to push and run away with the Razor Swine advantage, and you just need something to check that. And then sweepers segue really nicely into a fundamental aspect of the cube. There's very little in the cube that allows a player to generate card advantage. Because you only get going on turn 3 when you can cast a Razor Swine, because there's so many 0 and 1 mana interaction spells, you really cannot give players access to multiple cards, at least multiple cards in a way that they don't earn in some way tied to leveraging Razor Swines. I've had Staff of Completion in the cube for a bit. It's a 3 mana artifact that has a bunch of activated abilities that all cost life. One of them is pay 4 mana, draw a card. Like Sylvan Library is a non-starter here. Being able to draw 2 extra cards for 8 life. Well, you have 8 life to pay. Your opponent's just not going to punish you for doing that. And just card advantage, especially with all the cheap removal, especially because all you have to do is stop your opponent from killing you with Razor Swine. Too easy of a box to check. I have had like Lifecrafter's Bestiary, which is a 3 mana artifact that scries 1 every upkeep, and whenever you cast a creature, you can pay a green mana to draw a card. That just enables you to too easily trade Razor Swines in combat until your opponent eventually runs out. So just drawing extra cards too easily, that's too powerful here. It's not going to play in fun ways. I currently have Collected Company. That one's potentially scary, but it's fun because it's not guaranteed. And in order to really leverage it, you do need to have a high density of Razor Swines. And I haven't talked about the number of Razor Swines actually in the queue. I said it's 30 to 50 Feral Hogs. It is 30 Razor Swines, and everybody needs them. I generally find having less than 7 or 8 Razor Swines generally is going to put you in kind of a bad spot because you do want to get them online as early as possible, and you also want to be able to disrupt your opponent playing Razor Swine. And if everybody wants 8, well, if you do a 4-player draft, that's 32. There's not enough for everybody to have 8. And Collected Company math, 8 is not enough. You really need to highly prioritize Razor Swine, which everybody is prioritizing it because everybody knows they have to draft Razor Swines to win the game. I've cast Collected Company. I had it in a couple decks. The last time I drafted it, I had 9 Razor Swines. I really would have liked to have had the 10th. In a 3-game set, I hit 2, 1, and 0 Razor Swines off of the 3 Collected Companies I cast, the full spread. And actually, the only one of those games that I won was the game where I hit 1. Hitting 2 Razor Swines, it can be really real, but I just got caught by Contagion the time that happened. So there's ways to check it. You know, it's an instant speed. The blue counter magic is pretty good at insulating against that. It also just costs 4 mana. By the time you're playing a 4 mana spell, your opponent can have Razor Swine plus removal spell up without too much difficulty in this environment. So Collected Company is one that I'm going to watch, but it is less consistent and less powerful than stuff that guarantees, definitely stuff like Staff of Completion that always gives you multiple cards, and stuff like Lifecrafter's Bestiary that gave you a stream of cards. So it's something that I think fits a little bit better with this space. It's also a really funny Collected Company and Once Upon a Time, these cards where they have seen a lot of constructed play, Once Upon a Time being banned in multiple constructed formats, where the idea is to give you high access to a range of things, but in this cube it's like, all right, you are looking for Razor Swines in the specified number of cards in the top cards of your library. So I think that is pretty charming. And then on the topic of card advantage cards that I have, I guess I never actually tried this one, but just to kind of highlight the stuff that I think is too strong for the environment, I do not and have never tried Tezzeret's Gambit, which is 3 mana plus 1 Phyrexian blue to draw 2 cards and proliferate. I think that just 3 mana, I think Divination is not a fun card for this environment. I think that is too strong. I do have a good sampling of Proliferate here, and I also, just regarding Proliferate, I want you to be able to increment your opponent's poison counters. I want you to be able to increment +1/+1 counters so you can win more exchanges in combat by proliferating. But I don't have ways to proliferate multiple times, like sustained proliferation. Karn's Bastion, Contagion Clasp, those cards are just too strong here. They allow you to circumvent the parameters of the cube by too much. And Tezzeret's Gambit drawing 2 cards, I think that is just plainly too strong in this environment. And once you have that as a baseline, it kind of informs a lot of cards that would be appealing and strong here, and you can clearly see what I think is too strong. I want to make sure you are trying to optimize casting Razor Swines and engaging with the game that way, not playing a control deck, not running your opponent out of cards. And on those lines, I've experimented a little bit by having a small sampling of different creatures that would have been a singleton in the environment, or even alternate win conditions. And I just did not like the feel or the play for any of the other creatures. I just wanted it to be all Razor Swines. It is easier to explain, and I think that the texture of the games is more fun that way. And I tried some stuff, a couple different Planeswalkers. I tried one that is clearly too strong. I'm not even going to name it. But then I also tried Jace Beleren, and that is just it's too hard to attack down a Planeswalker, even one that maybe is going to give your opponent some cards. Jace Beleren is pretty close to Divination as a floor, and it's going to see its ceiling more often than I would like. And, when I had Jace and I was trying Planeswalkers, I had some removal that could specifically answer Planeswalkers, but it's just not something I really want the games to be about. It really distracts from the core premise, and I think that those made the cube less fun when they were in. So the cube right now, it is all Razor Swines all the time. That's what the games are about, and that is where the fun can be optimized here. So now let's talk about lands. There's some really interesting things happening with the mana base in this cube. I actually have 45 total lands in the cube. Some of these are just utility lands, it's about 40 mana fixing lands, and then some utility stuff going on. But because you always have to play red, I wanted to make sure to have a really high volume of red lands. So I have some cycles where I specifically only have the red entries. I have the 4 red temples, I have every red triome. You're never going to play a Golgari deck in this cube. You're never going to play an Azorius deck. You need to play Razor Swines to win. There's not alternate win conditions. I mean, I think that it's possible you could draft a deck where you try to kill all your opponent's creatures, but the card advantage spells that you would need to leverage to do that, sorry, not card advantage, card draw spells, excuse me, card selection spells. If you're casting Ponder and Preordain to make sure that you can answer all your opponent's Razor Swines, because you need to cut through not just their Razor Swines, but also their protection spells, there's a real chance that you deck yourself first. So it hasn't happened yet that somebody has presented a deck that's just good at answering Razor Swines. Maybe it's possible. There's some stuff that can give your opponent a poison counter outside of combat, some spells that give them the first poison counter, and there are a number of ways to proliferate. It's really hard, though. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it hasn't happened yet, and it may as well be impossible until somebody proves me wrong. But anyway, you're not going to play an Azorius deck. You're fighting really steeply uphill if you want to do that. So you have a lot of red fixing lands. But then I do have the full cycle of fetch lands, because when you have access to those triomes, some red dual land, those become red lands. And I have the full 10 surveil lands, partly because that's more stuff you can find with your fetch lands, even though you're not going to play Azorius. Meticulous Archive still plays even if you're just blue-red or red-white, and just having something you can fetch up. And it's also really useful, I said I have those red temples, just having these surveil lands and temples, because a lot of the games you are going to want to play a tap land if it can give you any kind of utility on the first couple turns. Again, you can't really play the part of the game that matters until you're casting Razor Swine. Surveil lands and scry lands, those are going to be really useful. They're going to add some texture to your deck. And I also have some stuff that cycles. I have the 2 mana cycling lands, of course, the triomes cycle, and just some stuff that can, similar to modal dual face cards, add some spell density in the land column to make the games, give players more agency, make the games more engaging in that way. And then I also want to call out, a lot of it is because I want the triomes knowing that you have to play red, and I want you to have some ability to play a 3 or even a 4-color deck. Notably, the pitch spells and the strength of the pitch spells does generally incentivize players to play a 2, maybe splash a 3rd color deck, but I don't mind players playing 4. I haven't seen it, but even if you played a 5-color deck, I would not consider it offensive in this environment, because you have to be base red in that way, and you can also kind of remove yourself from access to some powerful spells by not having the density to pitch spells. There's give and take there that I find engaging, but importantly, I don't have mana fixing lands that enter the battlefield untapped, with the exception of the Horizon lands. I have the red Horizon lands here, your Fiery Islet, your Sunbaked Canyon. I guess it's just the 2 because you don't have allied counterparts, but you can't fetch up a Shock land or an ABU duel. You have to spend some time playing those tap lands, and there's good incentives to do it. Surveil lands, scry lands, those are useful to play tapped. They give you something for it. The cycling lands, they can be cycled late so you don't get flooded. But I'm also not making it so you can easily have access to your colors with untapped lands. And that just plays really well with the constraints about all the games being around players casting this 3 mana creature. I really enjoy the way that that plays. Not using untapped lands here has played really well, and really for a lot of reasons there. And then there's some fun utility stuff here. Kessig Wolf Run. Quicksand is a very funny one. Just I really like the idea. You're being chased by a feral hog. Maybe you'll try to trap it in some quicksand. That's a really fun flavor win there. And one of my favorites, when I was first working on this cube, I'm sorry, I don't remember who suggested it. Somebody suggested this back when I was on Twitter, is Urborg. Just Urborg from Legends. We always call it Urborg, just Urborg when we play it in this cube, because we're not talking about Urborg to remove Yawgmoth. We're talking about a card just named Urborg that is a legendary land that taps for black, or you can tap it to remove the Swamp Walk or First Strike ability from any creature. So Urborg is a land you can leave up. If you get into a Razor Swine combat, you can make your opponent's Razor Swine lose First Strike and you win that combat. This does not necessarily make you safe from a protection spell. There's still some game to be played there, but it is strong. It's not on the level of like Caracas, but it is a pretty effective card. I think it's a pretty high pick in the cube. It has never been like backbreaking and punishing. It's got some people have reacted really dramatically to it, but I think it's both fun because it's so obscure and goofy. And I do think that it plays better than some people might think. It's just really fun to have around, and because the card doesn't see play anywhere else, I'm always really happy to give a home to some obscure Legends card. Just some stuff from the earliest sets in the game, this foundational stuff for Magic. And it's just such a goofy card. Like the Swamp Walk thing isn't real, so it's fun for that reason. I love Urborg, just Urborg. And then circling back from the mana base, I want to talk about gold spells a little bit. Most of the gold spells in this cube, they are going to have red in their casting cost because the idea is you always have to play red. In fact, I just really haven't spent any time looking at any non-red color combination for gold cards to put in this cube. I have Revitalizing Repast because it's an MDFC, can pitch as a black card, can pitch to Bounty of the Hunt. And a +1/+1 counter is something that can play with Proliferate. Revitalizing Repast can save you from a removal spell, and just having this thing that can be kind of a spell, albeit not a very strong one, in the land column is a useful aspect and kind of a fundamental aspect of this environment. I like what Revitalizing Repast adds to the cube, even if it's not a very high pick, something that just gives you a little bit of more density of black cards for all of those black pitch spells is pretty meaningful here. And then a light touch on artifacts as well. Heirloom Blade is one of the cards that I tried in this cube that ended up in practice as being too powerful. It's an equipment that gives +3/+1 to a creature, and then when it dies, you reveal cards from the top of your deck until you reveal a creature that shares a creature type. So it just allowed you to win the game in 2 hits. Equipping a Razor Swine with Heirloom Blade gives you a 5-power attacker, and then it's something that if your opponent kills after you equip, if like their plan against your Razor Swine is to trade in combat, you just get card advantage every time that that happens. So that played too powerful. When I was trying some of the other stuff early on, it seemed inoffensive as I had some of these stronger cards like the Lifecrafter's Bestiary. It played fine at that time, but as I have really zeroed in on where I want the power level and the balance to be, Heirloom Blade just was too strong. Sigil of Distinction is something that has kind of diminishing returns, gets weaker over time, that you have to tap a lot of mana to make use of. That one's played a lot better. Gavel of Righteous is one that I found when I was working on this cube. That's kind of an obscure commander card, but I've been really happy with the way that it plays, and it just really specifically slots into this environment. I like the idea of something that costs 2 that sets you up for the late game, and I've tried a couple different things, but many of them end up being too powerful. But Gavel of Righteous is something that applies pressure, I think, in an interesting way. It's a 2-mana equipment, where at the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a charge counter on it, and then equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each counter on it. And then as long as it has 4 or more counters, the creature gets double strike. You're well into winning the game territory at that point. But then notably, it equips for pay 3 mana or remove a counter from the gavel. So this 0 mana equip cost, this ability just kind of scale over time to, if you wait a couple turns, allowing you to win an exchange against Razor Swines. And then there's a small number of answers to artifacts in the queue. Not a ton. I used to have more when I was experimenting with some stronger artifacts or enchantments. It's going to be stuff like Hit Run, Who, What, When, Where, Why has a mode that everybody has access to. The red mode on there can destroy an artifact, and that's one of your cards that pitches to Blazing Shoal. And then also Gavel Righteous. It's not strong against removal spells to play an equipment that does not generate card advantage. So that one is kind of an obscure one. It's a weirdo that I discovered working on this environment, and I have been happy with how it has played. And anytime that I feel like I found a card that nobody has heard of that just naturally fits somewhere, the way that this plays with Proliferate, the way this allows you to scale in the Razor Swine combat equation without being overpowered, I've been really happy and having fun playing with this one. Also, giving your pig a hammer. That's funny. And that's going to be it for my breakdown of 30 to 50 Feral Hogs, the Razor Swine Twobert. Actually, one more thing. I just remembered this. It's 30 to 50 Feral Hogs. There's 30 Razor Swines in the cube, and that's a number that people are going to question. I had an awareness. Okay, well, what do you do? Do you have a modular number of Razor Swines in the cube where you guarantee at least 30, but it could be more? No, I think that 30 is a number that has played really well, that adds enough tension and texture to the draft and play environment. What I have landed on is I have in the cube box 20 unsleeved basic mountains and 20 razor swines, the 31st through the 50th. And if you think that somebody drafted an awful deck, you can grab that stack of cards and say, I bet you can't even beat the Hogs. And you can play your 20 mountain, 20 razor swine deck and try to embarrass your friend that way. So that's where we get the 30 to 50 number for anybody that's been wondering about that. And that will conclude my breakdown of 30 to 50 Feral Hogs. A couple weeks ago, I did my episode on why I really value maintaining singleton in cube design. Last week, I talked about the Tundra, a cube that heavily breaks singleton, and then 30 to 50 Feral Hogs. This is a cube that is foundationally about breaking singleton for a specific win condition and really designing a play environment around that. And I hope that this highlights ways that you can make that compelling and fun and interesting with a good enough hook. Shout out again to Andy Mangold for his work on 100 Ornithopters, for his innovative creativity in the cube space, how that has really carved a path to explore something I certainly never conceived of, just playing a bunch of copies of one thing and making the cube about that. That is such a fun way to break singleton. It is such a creative way to innovate in the cube space. The 100 Ornithopter cube itself is great. Definitely check that out. That's going to be one of the featured cubes at Shoebox. Go to shoebox.gg, buy your tickets, get your entry into the cube main event. I'm going to see you there. Get a sticker from me. Come say hi. We're going to have fun at Shoebox. I might have the 30 to 50 Feral Hogs cube in my backpack. This is one that I really enjoy playing. Challenge me to a game. If you find me when I've got some downtime, decent chance I'm going to want to play this one. Spent a lot of time mulling over this cube, theory crafting what is fun about it, refining those aspects, removing cards that weren't up to my standards, and this is one that's gone over really well with everybody that I've played with. This is maybe my favorite cube that I've designed at this point in time, and the silliness of it is certainly an aspect of that, but that is just the whole thing. Cube is about creativity, about finding the fun and making the fun, and 30 to 50 Feral Hogs, it's a lot of fun. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening today, for everything you do to support the podcast, liking, commenting, reviewing, subscribing, sharing. Tell your friends, tell your acquaintances, tell your enemies, tell people you never met that you love 180 MTG. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week talking more Cube. Later, gamers.